Good afternoon. My name's Mick Napier, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Every week, or most weeks, we interview someone who we think has something significant or very significant to add to the discussions of how to deliver effective solidarity to the beleaguered people of Palestine. We have had a galaxy of talent here over the last year. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Tim Llewellyn. Tim is the author of he's the author of a book on Beirut and Lebanon, and he's also written the latest introduction to the latest version of this classic, Publish It Not, of which more later. But he was also, for his sins, the Middle East correspondent of the BBC. Tim, what decade was that?
Sorry, what?
Which decade was that?
I started in the mid-70s, 1974 in Beirut. I stayed there till 1980. And then after a difference of opinion with the Syrians, I went back again to be based in Nicosia, covering the same area in 1997. So I was there much of the 2 decades between 1970 and 1990, and then went back as a freelance for the BBC until about 2000.
Okay, can I just ask you a very quick question then, and it might frame. Last year, I think, what's his name? John Gunter Dean, the US ambassador to Lebanon, died, and other posts died. I mean, in 1980, I think it was, somebody tried to murder him with rocket attacks on his limousine. He insisted until his dying day it was an Israeli job through a front organization. There's just written a book, Ronan, I forget his name, but it's called Rise and Kill First, about Mossad's assassination programs. And in the book, he confirms that the Israeli highest echelon set up the front group who claimed the hit on the US ambassador in Lebanon. Now, he's been all over the media in the USA, and they've talked about all sorts of things. It's very sexy to talk about Mossad assassinations, but not a word about an Israeli attempt to kill a US ambassador. Can you explain that? Give us some background to that, Tim, because you were in Lebanon for so long, yeah?
Well, I read about this in the newspapers. I read he'd said this. The broadcasters, of course, are deeply sensitive about any mention of Israel in an unflattering light. And of course, the idea that as this ambassador claimed, he was a target by the Israelis would be something that I suspect the BBC would prefer to steer clear of. I don't know about the other broadcasters, but I know that this whole topic I think we are going to talk about today was the way the BBC is very close to the political sensitivities of the day. When I started out, things were very different. The Palestinians were an effective group, starting to make their diplomatic dash for the UN, for recognition around the world.
So we're talking about the 70s, Tim.
Yes, going back to the 70s.
Okay.
And it was my impression as a correspondent there in the 70s and 80s, covering the Palestinian question, both in Lebanon and in Palestine itself and in Israel. I never had anything reserved from me. I mean, I never had any cutting or quarrels or interference with what I said. And I was extremely frank about the Israelis. I was frank about the Palestinians too, but I was really frank about the Israelis. And I wasn't conscious as a correspondent of ever having any serious criticism or attempt to take my views off the screen. Now, I wasn't watching here then in England, in Britain, but I think I'd have known if there had been any problem. But when I came back, and worked for a year as a freelance from 1991 till about 2000, I began to notice big changes. And that's, again, I think the political climate in England was changing, in Britain was changing. and I can go into that in some detail, but that's my broad theory, is that the last 20 years now have seen a great change in the broadcasters' approach to the coverage of Israel and Palestine. And it's not a happy one, it's a misleading one.
You think it's deteriorated, Tim?
It's done more than deteriorate, it's collapsed. It's a shame. I mean, it's a shocking, I think, reflection on our broadcasters. And I name the BBC primarily, not because I was an employee of it. I'm a great admirer of many things the BBC does. But as someone who knows the Middle East well and who worked in it for 30 or 40 years, I think it's absolutely shocking. The BBC is your institution. We pay for it. It should be reflecting the realities of what's happening on the ground, and it just isn't. And of course, I have many examples.
But it is much wider than the BBC, is it not? I mean, one of your highly esteemed fellow professionals, and whom I think he writes brilliant stuff, Jonathan Cook, describes how he used to be quite widely published in The Guardian and various other, what used to be called Fleet Street. He said, but when he started to know what was going on, when he started to really understand what was going on and write about it, then these media openings dried up and he was unable to be published. Now, I know you very well, but just tell viewers, did you used to self-censor? Or was it really as open as you're saying it is, as it was, Tim, and deteriorated?
No, I didn't self-censor because I didn't think that was what the job of a BBC correspondent was. I told it insofar as whenever can, as I saw it. And of course, I know from experience that the Israelis were very unhappy with it. And they had every right to be, because it did not show them in a good light. I wasn't telling the story the way they wanted it to be told. Unfortunately, the situation now is, I think with the BBC and with some of the newspapers, is that they prefer to tell it the way the Israelis want it told, mainly because the savagery of the Israeli supporters of Israel itself, the savagery of the attacks on reporters, on correspondents, on executives, on producers, on editors, is something that men in suits behind desks do not like. They're frightened. And of course, no one wants to be accused of that, of this charge we hear all the time now, that if you say anything critical of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. This is one of the big successes that the Israelis have scored over the past, I'd say 15 years or so, is the introduction of this concept of being anti-Semitic if you're against Israel. And this really does, amongst other things, it frightens executives who are not men used to this kind of savagery of speech. You know, the Israelis ring up, they know extension numbers, they know how high to go, who's responsible for what. They have tremendous penetration in the BBC, and it's a very scary situation. So I think what we have now is a sort of system of self-censorship, and that's been working through in most areas since, I would say, about 2001, 2002. It's nearly 20 years now, and it's an outrage.
So you cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist.
Yeah.
But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to. Now, they have to kill journalists in some parts of the world and throw their bodies on rubbish heaps or torture or detain them. We don't do that here. Does the problem start now at the interview stage? I mean, is it a safe pair of hands at every echelon of the BBC these days, and by extension through the rest of the media? Is that how it works, Tim?
Yes, I think broadly, what happens is that, to put it very simply, and there are honourable exceptions to this. I believe Jeremy Bowen has worked very, very hard to tell us the truth up against significant odds. I could give you an example of what he has to deal with. But just to keep to the point at the moment, broadly speaking, I think reporters in the Israel-Palestine arena, correspondents, they know what's wanted and they know how to get their stories on the air. for instance, one of the things I've noticed, just to give you one example, is that these days, any stories of Palestinian plight at the hands of settlers, or the situation in Gaza, or Israeli military attacks on, the consistent excesses that the Palestinians have to put up with day by day throughout the occupied Palestinian territories, that those any story about that, any story about the misery of the Palestinians, which is something we need to hear about and we don't, has to be diluted by adding something about the misery of the Israelis. So it's a sort of self-vitiating process. I noticed the other day, Correspondent, this was after the news, or at least the news of the plan of annexing the West Bank, big parts of the West Bank, that the correspondent, the BBC correspondent there, did a very good piece detailing the day-to-day life and agonies that an ordinary Palestinian family have to go through. And I think it's absolutely valid that that story should be told and it should stand alone. Excuse me, I gotta. But what he did was, for the last half of the story, as it were, the second half of the story, he told us about why the settlers were there, what the settlers were doing, what problems they had. Now, this seems to me completely going against the grain. If you're going to have a story about Palestinians, have a story about Palestinians. Tell it like it is. Don't try and, as it were, say that, well, there are good reasons for this, and if the settlers have their problems too. It's this kind of reporting. It takes the meat out of everything. It takes the point out of everything.
But Tim,
the Israelis have plenty of chance of saying what they want to say. No one shuts up the Israelis, but the Palestinian voice is not being heard properly.
There must be this search for the sort of metaphysical balance somewhere in the BBC. I mean, on climate warming, on global warming, there used to be a search for balance, and for every
Yes.
sort of semi-smart scientist, they would bring on a nutter who would deny there was any man-made contribution to global warming. There was a balance there that had to be abandoned, but they know the balance. The balance is probably somewhere on a fulcrum that allows elite discussions to take place. There's a band of space within which a discussion can take place. And I would imagine that Israel has been committing atrocious massacres and murders for 60 years is not something that can be allowed within that notion of balance.
Yes,
I think it's profoundly dishonest, is it not?
I think it's the word balance is one that I think is an unfortunate word, because what the correspondent in any particular place has to be is impartial. I mean, I wasn't there as an ambassador for the Palestinians to the BBC, and I wasn't there as an ambassador for the Israelis. I was telling the story as a professional reporter, the way I saw it. And it seems to me that that story, which is about occupied people and occupiers, there's only one impartial way to tell it. And that's that way, that this is an occupying, I'm talking now about the occupied territories, not getting into the business of Israel and the state law and that kind of thing. But in the, so much of the reporting we hear from the occupied territories or about the occupied territories gives the impression that it's kind of war between equals, both sides as bad as the other. Israel is always retaliating against the Palestinian attack. Israel never starts anything. Israelis don't kill people, but Palestinians are killed. Palestinians kill people. There's all this, I mean, there's a lot of detail in this, but there's lots of language, the way language is used very, very vividly about the Palestinians, but somehow slightly sub-fusk about the Israelis. And it's something I've been noticing, this lack of will to explain the situation properly. And it's not just me. In 2006, 2005, 2005, I think, the BBC Board of Governors set up an impartiality commission to look into this. They took evidence from all across the spectrum. They took evidence from Greg Philo, whose excellent book you'll know of, his book with Mike Berry, Bad News from Israel, which had just come out and was examining in detail many of the things I'm saying. They took evidence from Greg, they took evidence from the Israeli embassy, they took evidence from people on all sides, including yours truly. And they came out with what I thought was these were, you know, the good and the great. There was the Bishop of Armagh was one of them. I mean, these were solid citizens, right? These were not people with any direct involvement in the Middle East. They were as impartial as it gets. And their report, which came out in 2005, I thought was a brilliant assessment of what the BBC was doing wrong. And it mentioned this whole question of impartiality and not explaining what the Palestinians and the Israelis were at, what had got them to the stage they were at then. It's 15 years ago. And they were very critical of the BBC. And the BBC did virtually nothing about it. In fact, it got worse after that. Now, as I say, there are one or two experienced reporters like Jeremy Bowen, who's an old friend and colleague of mine, who I admire. And I can see the struggle he has when he's in Israel to try and get the truth on the air. And he's got into a lot of trouble trying to do that. But he has the authority and the clout to do it. Now, most of the reporters out in that region, I'm afraid now, do not have that authority or clout. They're youngsters, they're finding their way. And in this atmosphere of so-called balance that you were talking about, but not impartiality, I think most of them, they tend to tell the story the way they think it's going to be least offensive. And that means least offensive to the Israelis. And of course, the background to all this is that we now have a government. We've had a government, two different governments since 2000, which have more or less, since 9/11, have thrown in their support with Israel to a much larger degree than previous British governments had done between 1970 and 1990. Even Mrs. Thatcher's government, you know, there were a couple of junior ministers who came out to Palestine during the first Intifada, who were really critical, openly critical of Israel, and the Israelis didn't like it. That was all reported fair and square. That's under Mrs. Thatcher. But I'm afraid partly the advent of Tony Blair, partly 9/11, the curse it brought on the Arabs, the association of all Arabs with terrorism, and various other events, the BBC's distressing experiences with the Blair government over Iraq. All these and many other things went into the pot to make the BBC a very nervous creature in the middle of the 2000s. And that's the way it's stayed ever since, I'm afraid.
But I spoke to somebody who analyses media in the UK, up in Glasgow, and he said that when he speaks to senior executives and senior staff, not just at the BBC, but in the Murdoch Empire and elsewhere, after he's done his field research, they sit down and talk, and he says, look, you know this isn't right. You know the way this is going out, it doesn't reflect the reality. And he says you'd be very surprised how often he hears the same phrase coming back. I've got a mortgage.
Well, I mean, I think
I've got a mortgage. Well, now, this is really shameful, isn't it? Tim, could you recommend to any young person today to become a journalist? I mean, where can they go to tell the truth? It's been closed off and closed down, is it not? I've got a mortgage. Therefore, I'm going to go along with the dissemination of state broadcasting mythology.
No, I mean, it's easy. I think it's easy to be critical, but people do have mortgages. They have children. They want to keep their jobs. And, you know, one of the things about the media today is that it seems to me it's a lot less genuine than it used to be. It's a very highly paid racket now. People making the sort of decisions I'm talking about, not reporters. I'm talking about managers, editors, chief executives. These people are paid fantastic salaries by comparison with those who were in those positions when I was a young man reporting for the BBC. And I think that it's true to say that the higher your salary, the higher your take, the less keen you are on giving it up. And that's probably a disease which has crept through the BBC in this particular area. It's a terrible shame. And I was very lucky that I happened to, that most of the years I worked for the BBC, 30 years basically in the Middle East, before I started to lose my admiration for them, started to spot these things we're talking about. I was very lucky in that the atmosphere was very different. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were always times you felt your story should have a bigger play and it didn't, but that, you know, that's the luck of the journalistic draw. I'm very disappointed in the BBC, and I feel for the people who still have to work there, because I know that they know that what they're doing is wrong, but they can never admit it. And I've heard from people who've just left, reporters and correspondents who are out of the system now, and they will tell you the most horrifying stories about being you know, managed. I mean, one reporter told me, this is an awful story, I won't identify who it is, even by gender, but she was having a private conversation in the King David Hotel with an Israeli, as you and I might have, maybe disagreeing about this, agreeing about other things. That conversation was reported back to his line manager, and he was carpeted when he got home and told in these words, "We know where you're coming from." A warning shot across the bows, I think. And after that, this correspondent no longer visited that part of the world, was sent off to other duties in other equally stressful parts, but not Israel-Palestine. So
Tim, I've got some questions piling up here. Do you feel, Tim, that the current censorship in the Labour Party of their own membership mirrors the situation facing British journalists? So I guess, are we talking about intimidation? Are we talking about being successfully intimidated? What's your thoughts on that, Tim?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Your line's a bit muffled.
Do you think the situation inside the Labour Party of intimidation
inside the BBC
of their own members, does that mirror the situation inside the media? Are we dealing with a similar phenomenon?
You mean the situation that they had in the Labour Party?
Yeah, massive intimidation.
It's probably not quite as crude as the Labour Party was. I mean, that was a vile experience we all had the last 3 or 4 years of these lies being told about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. That was a vicious battle to keep a system out of government. And the Israelis played a full part in it, because the last person they wanted to see as prime minister was Jeremy Corbyn. And we know they played a part in it. But incidentally, that part was never talked about by the BBC. The Al Jazeera film, we never heard much about that. And we certainly didn't see a mention of it in John Ware's famous Panorama. So I don't think that inside the BBC it's quite as crude as that. I think the example I gave, you know, is quite a rare one. I think it's a question of self-knowledge, self-censorship, knowing that there's a way of putting things that the bosses will like, and the story will run, and a way of not doing it. And I'm sorry this has happened. It didn't happen for 30 years, and I think it does reflects the nervousness of the BBC about the government of the day.
Okay, Dave Black asks, Tim, in your opinion, what is the BBC's vested interest in maintaining this bias? What's in it for them? Is it really a case of them being ideologically corrupt or genuinely ignorant? Who are they trying to appease and why? There's a bunch of questions, Tim.
Well, I think it's a question. There are two things here, aren't there? There's what we've talked about is the responses of the Friends of Israel, the supporters of Israel, and the Israeli embassy. The Israelis have built up a tremendous propaganda machine in this country since 2000. They'd made a lot of mistakes in the previous years, Sabra Shatila, the first Intifada, the breaking of bones. Until after Oslo, the Israelis were not playing the game very well. although they had the edge over the Palestinians, they were making massive mistakes. Public opinion was and is drifting away from them. So they've redoubled their efforts since 2000. They've got a new propaganda organization in London called BICOM, British Israel Communications, and they've put a string of really sharp operators into their embassy in London. We know their names, and they've been ambassadors. They've also been press spokesmen, but mainly ambassadors, and they've all really known where to apply the screws. So there's that thing which I think the BBC and its people find daunting. It can be daunting if you're not used to it. The other thing is, I think it's a question of the BBC's survival. You know, the BBC depends on the government of the day for its license fee, and there's always that shadow hanging over the BBC, the license fee. And as you know, this government is particularly opposed to the BBC, and we saw it menacing the BBC in the last election, refusing to appear on programs, refusing to be questioned by senior interviewers, throwing its weight around. So I think that's a very important element with the BBC, that they know that they have to some extent to try to keep the government of the day sweet. And the Israel-Palestine question is probably one area where they feel that they can do that.
Palestinian, Rudy. Thanks, gentlemen, for the Zoom meeting. As a Palestinian stateless person, I totally disagree with the terms Arab-Israeli conflict. Terms like ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, and military occupation. Why is it so difficult to name things such as that at the BBC?
I didn't hear all that question.
Terms like ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, and military occupation. The last one can be used, but it seems to be impossible to name what Israel is doing as ethnic cleansing.
If I hear you, is the questioner saying that these words aren't used?
Yes.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, these phrases have been sort of quietly dropped. As I said earlier, the whole awful situation there. It's not even a conflict. It's certainly not a war, but it's never called by what its true name is. It's a oppressive military occupation with men with guns, planes, tanks, and battleships stealing other people's property day by day. That's what. Now, I don't expect to hear a BBC reporter use those words on the air, but that's the fact of the matter. We're talking about militarily backed theft of property, of lives, of hope, of future. From a.
Can I share something with you? There's some of these things happen and it stays with you forever. I can't even remember the year, but there was a prisoner exchange on the Lebanese-Israeli border, and a lot of bodies were being returned to Lebanon because the Israelis used bodies as bargaining chips. And I think 2 bodies were being returned to Israel of airmen who had obviously invaded Lebanon and been caught and died in the process. And there was somebody in the London studio and somebody on the border in the situation. And I remember something shocking happened. The person in London said, well, look, the families must be really distressed. And then made some commentary. Now remember, there are hundreds of bodies going north of Lebanese and Palestinians, and there's 2 bodies going south. And the guy in the London studio said, the families must be really, really distressed. Can you comment on that? And the journalist said, yes, both the families have been on TV and talking. They didn't even have to choreograph. They understood that Israeli families counted and Arab families did not. I recorded that, but I've lost it in the last few years.
Yeah.
Do you find that credible?
Well, it happens all the time, I'm afraid, not perhaps quite so blatantly as that. But certainly a lot of the reporting of deaths in the occupied territories are are brushed over. The details aren't shown to us. We don't get much explanation of who died and why. Every now and then there will be an item that crops up, but you know, the Palestinians are treated more or less, especially in the Gaza Strip, they're treated as a sort of faceless mass. The Israelis make it very difficult for journalists to go there, but even when it was easier to go there, there was still this kind of, I thought, very bland reporting of the Gaza Strip. There were exceptions, but you know, the situation in Gaza isn't reported anymore because no one goes there. Very few people go there. I mean, books are written about it, but you know, the day-to-day reporting. I mean, it's a really sad situation that the Palestinian story.
We're not really talking about the inheritance of empire. That when Jewish Israelis are killed, they're humanized, they're named. We often learn about the circumstances. We often learn about the tragedy, and we're often shown the funeral. But Palestinians die, and they're not even named. We rarely go to the funeral. There seems to be I mean, the fish might be the last to discover water, but there seems to be a really intense racism at work, which is not just the BBC, it's structurally built into the society. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I remember there was a marvelous young television reporter from Gaza, a Gazan girl who came to speak to us in Glasgow last year at a conference the Balfour Project organized about the media in the Middle East. And one of the things she said was just this, that, you know, the Palestinians are treated as faceless people. Their individual stories are very rarely told, you know, and if you saw this girl, you know, you'd know that it was extremely moving because she was saying that we exist, we die. But there seems to be a lack of equivalence, if you like, between being Israelis are people like us. The Palestinians are not people like us. That's the overall concept, I think, that's true of our broadcast media, certainly. It's something I thought we were getting over, but I don't think it's happened yet. I think there's still a long way to go with this idea that Palestinians have the right to life as much as anybody, and they're being denied it. And that doesn't come across in the reporting. On the rare occasions the story makes the news these days, as I said at the beginning, there's always this spurious balance between Palestinians having a hard time and Israelis, of course, also having a hard time.
Yes, the equivalence of Gaza bombed back to the Stone Age, pictures that are almost impossible to believe after the devastation, and a house in Sterot with a very large firework poking through the ceiling to suggest equivalence. Could I not just be lazy about this, Tim? Why don't I just say, look, what you're saying is true, but it's not just Palestine. It's the State Broadcasting Corporation, for God's sake. It's controlled by the state at arm's length. Press TV is said to be state-controlled media. The BBC is public broadcasting. But surely it's not just Palestine. I mean, let me give just one example. Is you can hardly buy the Sun newspaper on Merseyside, because they had a bitter experience of lies that the footballs at Hillsborough, they were pissing on the dead, they were rifling the pockets of the dead, and it burned really deeply into people there because they knew, and everybody knew somebody who said that was a disgusting lie. But you know, British miners went through the miners' strike in '84, and they learned about the Guardian and the BBC and how they were treated and how they were mistreated in the media. They learned it, but most people don't learn that in their everyday lives. Palestinians can, miners can, people in Merseyside can, but most of us don't, and we kind of rely on okay, how about this? It's a tsunami of deception right across the board, whether we're dealing with the poor and the homeless and refugees or people in the Channel. And Palestine is just a particularly egregious example of this dishonesty that you've rewritten a a fresh foreword for the fresh edition of the book, has been going on for a very long time, hasn't it?
If you read that, I was really disappointed, or I am disappointed now, to read that. I read that forward again before I did a talk the other day on Zoom, and it's depressing. Nothing has changed. I mean, absolutely nothing has changed. And it's an incredible book, that, because it shows that in the 1950s and 60s, very much the same sort of bias against journalists who tried to report properly on what was happening in Israel happened. We had Michael Adams, who you may remember, who was a great Guardian journalist, who was discovering atrocities committed by the Israelis after the end of the '67 war. And he, the editor of the Guardian, refused to use it, refused to use the piece. Later on, Jonathan Cook, who's an excellent first-class journalist, had similar problems at the Guardian, although the Guardian does have a great track record of first-class correspondence there. So it comes and it goes. The problem nowadays is that the story isn't a story at the moment, as far as the news desk is concerned. We're obliterated by COVID-19, by Brexit, by domestic affairs. There's been a ghastly civil war in Syria. There's, of course, Iraq still. The Palestinian story, I'm afraid, has just had the curtains drawn over it to a very large extent by force majeure, by news editors just saying, well, there's nothing new there. It's the same old, which is awful, but I'm afraid it's a journalistic drawback.
You're too young, Tim, to remember, say, Kenya, where the British instituted a reign of terror, mass rape, mass incarceration in camps and so on. I knew a soldier who had been in the British Army in Aden, and he described over a few drinks, quite a few nights, the murderous tactics of Mad Mitch from Aberdeen, who commanded those troops in mass murder of that insurrection. But all of that was pretty well suppressed. I mean, who knows, even people listening here today, who knows about the poor sods from Diego Garcia, ethnically cleansed, 100%, went to the Supreme Court, won their case, British government says, get lost. Surely the main state broadcasting corporation has to be sort of complicit in the crimes of the regime. It can't be any other way, can it? Or am I just being lazy here?
Well, it should do. I mean, you could ask yourself, how could the BBC broadcast that panorama? It completely broke every rule of journalism, television journalism.
Oh, that shocking piece by Ware and the functionaries
how
from
could
the Israeli embassy.
How could an organization commission a program like that from a man who we know is an outspoken and loyal Zionist? I mean, I have nothing against John Ware being a Zionist. It's his choice. He's welcome to be one if he wants to, and he is one. But how could you commission a fully fledged Zionist to do a program about, is there anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? It's grotesque. So, my opinion of the BBC, I'm afraid, in this particular area, its coverage of Israel and Palestine and its coverage of the troubles of the Labour Party since 2015, they just broke all the rules about something really crucial to us all. And whether it lost Corbyn the election or not, I don't know. But the BBC certainly had it in for him. And you could tell by the way the reporting was twisted and meddled with. It seems to be that particular area, all connected with the Middle East, with Israel and Palestine, that rattles their cage, makes them nervous. And they've been tiptoeing about now for 20 years, and it's not getting any better, it's getting worse, especially as the story's, I'm afraid, now dropping out of sight under, in a sense, its own ghastly inertia. It doesn't change, it doesn't develop. We don't know whether, if there's a new president, whether that will make any difference. I doubt it, but there's no light on the horizon.
Tim, we've recorded and put on our website a tremendous program on the BBC, and it's professionals, it's people who really know what they're talking about, and it's their, I mean, don't switch off everybody. It's their statistics program every week, more or less.
Yes.
And statistics is the route to the truth very often, but they dealt one issue with grotesque allegations of anti-Semitism. Somebody had spoken up, and then the police had propagated this nonsense about anti-Semitism in London going through the roof, and they put forward statistics. So more or less dismantled the whole thing in a masterful professional way, as only professionals would do. So that was excellent, but you couldn't do that in the newsroom, could you? I met a producer at the BBC once in the arts department, and he said, "Look, it's okay for us, but in the
yeah.
section, it's tightly policed. Every comma, every piece of punctuation is tightly policed in terms of the news." Does that make sense to you?
There's a big difference, Mick, between what you see on the main news bulletins, for instance, the 6 o'clock television news, the 10 o'clock television news, both channels. And even now, to some extent, Channel 4 is not doing the job it used to do. This is what BBC bosses worry about, the mainstream bulletins, the ones they know the political bosses are going to be glued to, especially during an election period. So those are watched very, very tightly indeed. But you will occasionally, on some obscure radio program or in the middle of the night on some channel or other, get a story which does tell the truth, but it's locked away somewhere where it's not going to have a mass audience.
Tim, we can't stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning to catch a
snippet.
No, yeah.
It's the BBC will sometimes claim, but we did tell that story. Well, they didn't tell it at 10 o'clock. They didn't tell it at 6 o'clock. And that's of course, that's where the sensitivity is greatest.
Tim, a couple of questions. Jane asks, a common statement bandied about is that the BBC is Zion-controlled. What's your response to this statement, Tim?
That the BBC is what?
Is Zionist-controlled.
No, I don't believe that. I don't think that's true. I'm not aware, and I never was aware of there being any particular hierarchy in the BBC of Zionists at the top. There were some, but no, I don't think it's Zionist controlled in the sense that one might understand that as some sort of cabal of Zionists or pro-Zionists working all the strings. I think it is very much this question of not wanting to upset people, not wanting to upset a pretty cagey and ornery beast, which is the Israel lobby, and the BBC's general feeling that it should steer clear of getting down and dirty with the Palestine-Israel dispute.
But these institutions must bend to power, and if there's no counteracting power, presumably the state, the government authorities, the ability to attack the BBC and remove its funding, the ability to fire, the ability to let people's contract go, means that they must bow to that kind of power, do they not? Because there's no countervailing power from Ramallah.
I didn't quite get that, Mick. Sorry, your voice is a bit muffled.
The BBC operates within the context of power structures in the society.
Oh yes,
corporations,
sure.
Politicians, they must bend to that power, surely, because there's no countervailing power.
Well, they do bend to it, as we see, but different topics seem to rattle them more than others. I mean, for instance, I know it was a while ago, but during the apartheid period in South Africa, again, I'd spent some time in Africa, but watching it, whether listening to the overseas service or watching it here, I thought that by and large, the BBC's reporting of that long period of humiliation of the black population, colored population of South Africa was pretty fair. I don't think they got everything right. Some people complained that they were too, that the BBC was too hand on heart. But I thought the coverage on the whole was fair. So, but the South Africans, of course, didn't have the clout, didn't have the fingers in the pie that the Israel supporters have here, and they weren't frankly as scary a crowd to have ringing up first thing in the morning and last thing at night to curse you for every piece of your coverage if they didn't like it. So, and also the South African government, for most of that period, had become a pariah to all states. I mean, the United States, all the European states, of the whole world. So it was it was a proper target, but it was a much easier one than the state of Israel.
Tim, I've got a couple of questions for you before we kind of bring this to a quality conclusion. Lynn raises a key issue, not directly related to Palestine, but Julian Assange, I personally feel massively in his debt after WikiLeaks revealed the atrocious crimes being committed in Iraq, the murder by helicopter of journalists and Iraqis walking around. So Lynn asks, is the control of journalists not personified by the appalling situation facing Julian Assange? Why are journalists not shouting out about this? Surely this is the most blatant silencing of a journalist. Your thoughts?
Are you asking why aren't the journalists themselves making more fuss?
Yeah. Is this not for a professional journalist a particularly egregious example of a journalist being silenced and jailed?
Yeah. I suspect that what's happened in the last 20 years as regards this particular topic, that there were BBC journalists, including me, who were highly critical. The BBC used to meet us. We used to have meetings with these bosses and set out what we thought was wrong. And as I said, that there was an impartiality commission which handed down a very severe judgment on the BBC. But that was about the time that we published It Not with my foreword. Nothing shifted. We kept meetings, we kept writing, we complained, we rang up individuals, people inside the BBC and outside the BBC. But in the end, the iron wall was there, and it seems to be impenetrable. I mean, we must keep on complaining, but the BBC's closed its ears to us on this particular topic, I'm afraid.
I'm going to bring you to the last question, Tim, but I wasn't there, but I remember when the BBC declined to run even
the Gaza ad.
The unified charity thing for the humanitarian appeal for Gaza. Folks here in Edinburgh, some of our people, got hold of a projector and ran the programme. Tony broadcast it as well. But some people broadcast the programme that was banned by the BBC onto the walls of the BBC building in Edinburgh. I thought that was quite a clever way of doing it. That's to ask you a question, Tim. How do we change this, says Kate? What can we do to make the BBC and other media outlets change how they report on Palestinian oppression, but especially the BBC that's paid for by taxpayers' money? So, Tim, come on, how do we get robust journalism is the question.
Well, I've been asked that question, Mick, pretty regularly now since about 2001. And my answer was always more or less the same, is that all you can do is to keep up the pressure, keep ringing up producers, ringing up editors, writing to the BBC, but they've got an impenetrable complaint system. And if you remember the great panorama about the Mavi Marmara, there were 2,000 complaints about that program, which is a record for Panorama, 2,000 complaints. And the BBC itself dismissed all of them, but the BBC Trust, which in those days was the kind of overarching body running BBC editorial output. It was a kind of insider's court on top of the BBC structure. It replaced the governors, who are obviously too independent. The BBC Trust actually put through 7 of those protests and said they were valid, 7 out of 2,000. So, and I've been through this process over and over again. The BBC will just most of the time say, essentially, we disagree with you. Whatever you put out, they're going to say, well, we don't think that's the way it is. And of course, now you have Ofcom, but look how Ofcom dodged the Panorama program, the Way of Panorama. They used some flimsy timing excuse saying that, I mean, but to answer your question, I'm afraid there's nothing else you can do except keep at them and keep hoping that that you'll make a dent in the brickwork. But it's 20 years have gone by now and nothing's changed.
Tim, I lied to you. I lied to you. That wasn't the last question. I'm going to throw another one at you if that's okay. The BBC's been defunded. Boris Johnson and the right, the Tories, are threatening to defund it. Presumably Murdoch is waiting in the wings. But really, the role of the BBC on Palestine sticks in the nostrils of an awful lot of people. A lot of people are really pissed at the BBC. Should we defend the BBC from these right-wing attacks, or have they forfeited the right, by their dishonesty, have they forfeited the right for us to defend it? That's an open question, Tim. I don't know the answer. What do you think?
Yes, I think we should defend the BBC where it matters, where we feel an unjust complaint has been made. I don't think the BBC is the institution that should be disbanded or pummeled or cowed unnecessarily. I mean, but on this particular issue, the ones we've been talking about, I think it's disgraceful that the BBC is using your money to suppress proper coverage in this way. And I think we should keep at it and keep at it and keep at it as long as we live. Because if we don't, then they're certainly not going to do anything. But I'm not sanguine about a good outcome to this. When I look ahead now and I see the prospects of a Trump presidency continuing, a Joe Biden presidency possibly, 4 more years of Boris Johnson, and a group of, I would say, not terribly impressive men in senior roles in our British cabinet. And I understand that the situation in Scotland is by no means perfect either. The Zionists have an awful lot of clout all over the place. I just think we have to keep at them as hard as we can and hope that at some stage there'll be a breakthrough, but I can't see it coming. I really am quite bleak about that.
Tim, make some concluding remarks to the viewers.
Sorry?
Please make some concluding remarks from the vantage point that you occupied over 10 years inside the beast, if I can put it that way. How would you recommend people, what attitude should we take going forward to these terrible distortions that the BBC is peddling about Palestine? Final remarks, Tim.
I can only say what I've just said, Nick. We have to keep at them, keep writing, keep telephoning, keep protesting. It's all we can do. I don't think it's a good idea to burn down New Broadcasting House or attempt any other more salutary method. I think we just have to make our presence felt. It sounds feeble, I know, but it's a shame that even the people inside the BBC now have more or less given up. They prefer to cover something else than Israel and Palestine. And that, in a sense, is a real devastating way to keep the Israelis happy, not to talk about the situation at all. And that's really what's happening at the moment in a big way.
Tim, thank you very much. Tim Llewellyn, author of a couple of really, he's written an introduction to a tremendous book which very much maps onto the theme here. today, Publish It Not, How the Truth About Palestine, Israel has been suppressed for a very long time. He's also written a volume on Beirut and Lebanon from his years there as a BBC journalist. Tim, it's been a great pleasure. I remember you and I speaking at a meeting in Aberdeen on 9/11.
Yes, yes.
The 9/11. It was a rather tense evening, was it? Was it not?
It was Mick it was you that told me. You rang me on my you rang me. I was in Aberdeen Public Library.
Right. Yeah. Yes. I was in Aberdeen that day, and I was in a TV shop, an electronic shop, because I wanted to buy mobile phones. In those days were pretty feeble, and we wanted to bring in a guy from a Palestinian refugee camp, and we wanted to amplify the voice from my phone. So there was 20 TV screens on the wall, and I'm talking to this guy about something or other, and a plane's crashing into the Twin Towers 20 times, and I thought it was Bruce Willis or something like that. I wasn't paying any attention. And the Scotsman phoned up and said, hello, Mick Napier, Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Have you heard about a plane flying into the Twin Tower in New York? And I thought it was a small biplane or something, you know, some small private aircraft, a Cessna. I said, no, I haven't heard anything. He said, yeah, it seems to be a terrorist attack. Will you be cancelling your meeting in Aberdeen tonight?
Yes.
I said, why? The Palestinians are the victims of terrorism, of the most grotesque terrorism over decades. Why should we cancel a meeting because of a terrorist attack, which is in solidarity with the victims of terrorism? They didn't use that quote when they reported the story. Tim Llewellyn, a great pleasure from 9/11 until today. Keep on keeping on, and it's great to have these testimonies from inside the BBC.
Good to have you keeping up the struggle there, Mick.
Thanks, Tim. I certainly wouldn't, Tim, when Tim was talking about keeping up the pressure in the BBC, he advised us not to burn it down, and I certainly would echo that. I don't think we should burn, but I do remember leading a huge demonstration from Buchanan Street to the BBC headquarters in Glasgow, and it was our full intention to occupy it and to make a statement. The building had been occupied by anti-war protesters earlier, so I certainly recommend the tactic of occupation in order to show the anger that's rising against the lies put forward by the BBC. Friends, a couple of announcements. That, of course, doesn't substitute completely for all sorts of pressure such as Tim's been recommending. 3 minutes to the top of the hour. Next Sunday at this time, I'm delighted to be having a conversation with Gilbert Achar, a professor from SOAS in London, who's written extensively on Lebanon and the wider Middle East. And I'll be in conversation with Gilbert Achar on Palestine in the context of permanent war in the Middle East. So we'll be looking at Palestine within that broader context, devastation of Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, I could go on. But Palestine's very much a part of that. And I am reminded of an opinion poll. I mean, this is as rare as hen's teeth in Saudi Arabia, and there was one in every Arab country recently, which found out that well over 80, almost 90% of Arabs, when asked, insisted that Palestine was not just an issue for the Palestinians, it was an Arab issue. And I think there's room for optimism. They will not always be ground down and on their knees. In the long term, I think we'll win, but our job as a Palestine Solidarity Campaign is to try to reduce the cost of that ultimate victory, although it will be high. So that's next Sunday, 4 o'clock. Do join me. I'll put up or I'll ask Jimmy, our producer, to put up the Zoom registration for the discussion with Gil Achar next Sunday. Final announcement, two final announcements. We'll be at Hampden Park on Friday for the Israel-Scotland game. We'll have special banners, don't play ball with Israeli apartheid, quite a lot of them, and we'll be asking you to come and help us let the team bus when it comes in be in no doubt as to our message. We aim to heft up a very large helium balloon with a banner carrying the same message. And so that's next Friday night, if you can make it, for 6:30 at the car park at Hampden Park. If you're in any doubt as to the exact place, do get in touch and we'll tell you. Every day we post, for those who subscribe, a WhatsApp into your phone, and it really is getting a lot of support. It's quite dramatic. It shares information with even very active individuals they might not have already known. So if you'd like to join, if you'd like to have that in your phone every day, do get in touch. Mick Napier, on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, thanking Tim Llewellyn again and saying to everyone,
thank you.
Goodbye. Bye, Tim. Thanks again.